this book by Thomas Piketty, Capitalism or Capital in the 21st Century, has skyrocketed to the #1 position on Amazon. And, you know, I guess one way to get a top-selling economics book in America today is to advocate Marxism. If you advocate for a return to Marxism, then yes, you're going to get a lot of people reading your book. Write a book that defends the free market, and it's a much harder pill for America to swallow. Now, of course, the title of the book is Capital in the 21st Century. And I think a lot of people would think, is he referring to capitalism? Because we really don't even have capitalism in the 21st century. That's the problem. We have socialism in the 21st century. And, you know, I haven't read this book. If anybody has, maybe it'd be a good time to call in. But from what I've read about the book, you know, it advocates a very left-wing tax structure. But according to Tom Piketty, and we are trying to get him on the show to talk about his book. But the big problem that he sees is this big gap between the rich and the poor, the income inequality. And I agree that the gap is much wider than it should be. And I think it's much wider than it would be if we really had capitalism. See, the fact that Tom Piketty doesn't seem to understand is the reason for the inequality is not because we have too much capitalism, but we don't have enough. His solution is more government. His solution will make things worse for the very people he wants to help. In fact, he looks at 1971 as really when the gap really started to widen. And, of course, he overlooks the fact that that is when Nixon took us off the gold standard, and we went from sound money to fiat money. When we put our faith in central bankers and central planning, and the result is the problem that he is now writing about. But it's not just the Federal Reserve. I alluded to it earlier in the show, but the real problem is the decline in the value of wages, the labor, the return to labor that the ordinary individual. See, most individuals make their living by selling their labor, right? The businessman or the capitalist can make his money on his capital, on the returns on his capital, interest on savings, dividends on stocks, things like that. But a lot of Americans, their entire income is based on wages, selling their labor. They don't have capital. They just have their labor. And the government, through the tax code, has undermined the value of labor. Number one, income taxes hurt labor because they tax the sale of labor, and that is from the government. The income tax was devised by government. It is not something that is a creature of capitalism. It is an instrument of socialism. And the taxation of wages, of labor, right, is one of the most important things that has been undermining the average American and people all around the world, for that matter, and widening the gap between the rich and the poor. The other problem is all of the government regulations and mandates that are put upon employers that drive up labor costs. And because governments make it so expensive, unnecessarily expensive to hire people, as a result of that, wages have to fall. Because as I said earlier in the show, when you hire somebody, it's the overall labor cost that the worker needs to be able to cover with his productivity. And as the government makes it more expensive to hire people by mandating Social Security payments or workman's comp payments, or causing employers to have to spend more money policing their workforce to make sure that there's no racism or no sexism, and to set money aside for lawyers to the extent that they're being sued frivolously or otherwise. All of this stuff that makes it more expensive to hire people means that the worker himself gets a smaller share of his overall productivity, that the employer is forced to divert money that otherwise would have been paid to the workers. Instead, it's not paid to the workers. It's paid to the lawyers. It's paid to the bureaucrats. It's paid for insurance or whatever it is. And that is what is driving the gap. That is why the poor are getting poorer. It's because their efforts are being undermined by government, by taxes, by regulation. And now, what does somebody like Thomas Piketty, what is his solution to this government-created problem? His solution is more government. Instead of recognizing all the things the government has done to undermine the living standard of the average American, he just wants to take money away from the rich. He thinks the way to make the poor richer is by making the rich poorer. And he's advocating confiscatory rates of taxation on upper income people, on their income, and he's advocating wealth taxes. And I haven't read the book, so correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing or reading online, incomes above $500 or $1 million would be taxed, I think, at rates about 80%, according to Piketty. And he also, I think, wants a wealth tax. I think it's a 10%, I've read, a 10% tax on wealth, which means that, your wealth is just going to dissipate over time. It's going to be stolen. This is on the principle. But, of course, nobody bothers to think if the government is going to tax 10% of your wealth, meaning if I have $1 million, at the end of the year, if I still have the $1 million, the government's going to take $100,000 away from me. What does that mean? That means if I don't spend my money, if I invest it, the government's going to take 10% of it. That means that the return on investment has to be much higher than 10%. Otherwise, I'm going to spend the money. I mean, what about a loan? If you want to take out a loan, if you're an entrepreneur and you want to borrow money, the guy's not going to lend it to you for less than 10% because that means he loses out on the deal. Because if I make you $1 million loan and you pay me back $1.5 million, $1 million, and you pay me $50,000 in interest, the government's going to take that $50,000 plus another $50,000. I'm going to be $50,000 worse off. So everybody is going to have to pay a rate of interest that's more than 10%. So maybe the lowest interest rates would be in a Piketty world would be 15% or 20%. You want to borrow money, you're going to pay 15 or 20%. You can't pay 2 or 3 or 4 or 5%. That's impossible. Nobody would loan you money because they're going to be worse off. In fact, based on what Piketty is describing, the people that will be hurt the most are the poor and the middle class. There'll be no jobs, because there'll be no capital. I mean, you can't get a job unless somebody has capital, but no one is going to have capital if the government destroys it all. There's no incentive. I mean, if there's no reason to earn more than $1 million, I mean, no one's going to work with an 80% tax bracket. I sure as hell would. I don't know anybody who would if there's no way to avoid it. The only reason that people worked in the 1950s and 1940s when we had a top tax rate of 90% was because they didn't have to actually pay it. There were ways around it. It was only because of the loopholes that we survived those confiscatory levels of taxation. Yet you have people on the left who think that those are the actual tax rates that people paid, and that's why everything was so great, because the rich were paying all these taxes. No, they weren't. They were avoiding all those taxes. That's the only reason the economy didn't collapse. Of course, this whole idea that we should confiscate wealth and in the name of economic growth, that we should steal money from the rich and just give it to the poor. That's just communism. It didn't work in the Soviet Union. It's not working in Cuba. It didn't work in South in North Korea. It didn't work in Vietnam. Communism doesn't work anywhere. It didn't work in East Germany. It's never worked. Why does why does anybody reading this book, other than Paul Krugman, think, oh, gee, maybe now it will work? Now we really know how bad capitalism is because we've seen the results. And so now we're sure that if we just have Marxism, that it's going to work. I'm going to play a little sound from Bill Maher, who obviously just loves this book and thinks it's, great, talking about how, according to him, it's socialism that built America. That this book is great, and it reveals that whatever we have, we owe to socialism. It wasn't capitalism or freedom that made America great. It was socialism. It was that we finally embraced the ideas of Marx, and that's what created the middle class. He's got it backwards. You know, it's capital that makes labor productive. I mean, what created the middle class was the accumulation of capital. You know, we just got back. I was in Europe. That's why I was away from the show. And, you know, when you walk around some of these European cities and you look at the beautiful architecture and, you know, how nice some of these cities are, and you wonder, why did so many people leave? You know, why did my grandparents, all four of them, why did they leave Europe? Why was Europe so bad? Because it seems that, you know, things should have been pretty good over there. And the reason they all left was because of the freedom that existed in America that did not exist to that extent in Europe. It's because we had no income taxes and free trade and sound money, and we had all the things that now they tell us you know, we can't have. You know, the government didn't do any of the things that the liberals assure us the government must do. It was, you know, just, you know, free market capitalism, no safety nets, right? And that's what everybody wanted. That's what the poor wanted. They wanted that. They didn't want they didn't want all the safety nets. That's why they came to America, knowing that there were no nets whatsoever, knowing that if they fell, there was no government there to catch them, but there was no government standing in their way, which is what they were really concerned about. They didn't care about somebody to catch them if they fell. They just didn't want somebody preventing them from moving forward. And so they came to America for freedom, and that's what built the middle class. It was the capital that was accumulated into free America that the laborers had access to by way of their employers. That's what created it. But now, you know, you've got the left fawning all over this book. You know, it's just, you know, Marxism dusted off and rebranded. Of course, these same guys, they would have been loving, you know, if Karl Marx had never written, you know, Das Kapital, and if Marxism had never existed and Karl Marx wrote a book today, Das Kapital, it'd be number one on Amazon, it'd be number one on the New York Times. They would all be talking about how great it is, you know. And so they're saying the same thing, even knowing that it doesn't work. Because as long as you rebrand it, you put it in a different package, but it's the same old failed ideology, the left is going to eat it up, you know, with a spoon. But here's an example. This is Bill Maher, HBO, right? Listen to what he had to say about socialism and America and the middle class and this book. Here, it's cut number 11.
Sure, it's wrong to try to, you know, basically break down a 700-page tome into a few words, but I'm going to.
Let's do it.
Because, you know, come on, everything's too long anyway. Movies are too long, books are too long. Basically what this guy is saying is that under capitalism, income inequality is inevitable. And that when we had a thriving middle class after the war, after World War II in the 50s and the 60s, that was the aberration. And by the way, the reason why we had a thriving middle class then was because of socialism. Because the tax rates on the rich then were 70 to 90%. And the house I grew up in was under the GI Bill.
Right.
It's because my parents were veterans and they could, that's socialism. That's all socialism. Socialism built the middle class in America. Deal with that, conservatives.
I mean, come on. Come on. I mean, does this guy really think that, you know, everybody was poor in America until 1950 and 1960? That nobody could buy a house until the GI Bill? Is that what he really thinks? Does he really think that the middle class didn't exist and that it magically came into existence in 1950 because the income tax rates were jacked up? Is that what he actually thinks? I mean, this is unbelievable. I mean, the middle class in America was a byproduct of the economic growth that took place in the 19th century. That's what created our middle class. The prosperity that we enjoyed in the 50s was the payback from the freedom of the 19th century. That's where America's middle class was created, when we had no income tax at all. When it was pure capitalism, it was the higher taxes that began unraveling the middle class. It's the things that were introduced in the New Deal and later in the Great Society and the War on Poverty. That's when the middle class started to come down. That's when we started to reverse all the progress that had led up to our high point, our zenith in 1950 and 1960. And it wasn't the confiscatory levels of taxation that did that. It was the absence of taxation. Up until 1913, there was no income tax at all. And then up until the 1940s, the rates were still low and very few people paid them. All right, they got jacked up, and they were high in the 50s and 60s. But the reason that the economy didn't collapse was because those high rates were easily avoidable. Now, of course, all the things that we had to do to avoid those taxes were counterproductive and undermined our economy, but they didn't undermine it as much as paying the taxes would have. As unproductive as all the loopholes and the tax shelters made us, the taxes would have made us even more unproductive. But that's when Japan really got out. That's when we lost our edge during the 50s and the 60s. That's when all this manufacturing started to build up in Japan because Americans were too busy dodging taxes. They weren't making the investments that were being made in other countries. I mean, why does Bill Maher think so many immigrants came to America when there was just nothing but capitalism here? Why did they risk everything? Why did they leave their friends and their family, come to a country where they didn't even speak the language, spend whatever money they had on a one-way ticket across the Atlantic, a week boat trip in steerage? I mean, can you imagine what it was like to come across the Atlantic with nothing but the clothes on your back and then show up in America with no money and no knowledge of the language? Why did they do that? It was because of freedom. And obviously it couldn't have been bad, or they wouldn't have told their friends and their relatives to come over. But they kept coming. Masses and masses of immigrants came. And it wasn't because of socialism. It wasn't high taxes that built this country. If we had the type of high taxes that Bill Maher thinks built the middle class, if the founding fathers had started America with a 70 to 90% income tax, do you think we ever would have expanded beyond the original 13 colonies? The Native Americans would still be in charge around here if we had those kind of income taxes from day one. We would never have amounted to anything. There would be, in fact, nobody would have ratified the Constitution. That's for damn sure. Nobody would have been dumb enough to ratify it. But assuming they were dumb enough to do it, everybody would have left. Nobody would have stayed here. Nobody would have immigrated here because there would have been no opportunity. There would have been no capital. Nobody would have had any savings. Nobody would have had any investment. It had been the reverse. We'd have all, my parents, I'd be living in Europe, assuming that I was still born. I'd be in Eastern Europe somewhere because none of my ancestors would have come here. Nobody would have come here. It's just amazing how moronic Americans can be, that people can think these kind of thoughts, have this kind of attitude. I mean, given all the money that we spend, that we waste on education, that we can produce somebody as ignorant as Bill Maher. And only in America, probably, can you succeed. Can you become so rich, yet be so stupid at the exact same time? Capitalism is the only place where a guy like Bill Maher can succeed. He can succeed despite the fact that he's an idiot, because he's good at something, right? I mean, he's funny. He does his talk show. So despite the fact that he's an idiot, he can become rich, right? Only in a capitalist society can a guy like that succeed. Where else? I mean, what else can he expect? But he doesn't even understand that it's only because of capitalism, or what's left of it anyway, that he's able to succeed and live the luxurious lifestyle that I'm sure he has grown very accustomed to.